Hi, Savannah. Gonna present my semester project for you guys. Sorry if I ramble a lot. All right, so for my project, I decided to use epoxy resin. I wanted to use this material because I'd seen a lot of people using it on Instagram, and I just thought it was really interesting. And my dad has used it a couple times and enjoyed working with it. So I was just kind of curious and didn't really have a good reason to use it. And then we got assigned this project. So that's kind of why I chose the material I did. Um, so if you don't know what resin is, I'll kind of explain like the like dictionary definition of what it is, and then kind of go into more details. So basically, resin is an epoxy that is created by mixing liquid resin and a hardener in a specific ratio. So basically, it comes in like two jugs, and it's like a clear liquid, and then you mix it together. And then there's a chemical reaction that happens that changes that liquid into a solid. And the finished result usually looks kind of like a clear, thick plastic. But they're like different resins have different uses and different finishes. And then you can also add pigment, color, or alcohol inks, or other kinds of additives into the resin to change the color or whatever. And then that specific ratio is different for different types of resin. Um, the ones that I used, one was a 1-to-1 ratio, and then one was a 1-to-2. So it's like one part hardener for two parts of the resin, or one part hardener for one parts of the resin. So there's a lot of different uses for resin. I primarily focused on making art out of different molds, silicone molds, and pouring the resin in there, letting them harden, and then taking them out of the molds. Um, Another big use for resin is as a finish, like on furniture or on art pieces, um, on pieces of wood, with paintings on them, on canvas, all kinds of different ways you can use it as finishing. Um, and then also for furniture, like I said before, my dad used it to build a river table, which is really cool. If you have time to Google that, I would definitely check them out. Um, but yeah, you can do, and there's a lot of other stuff you can do with resin as well, but those are kind of the three main uses that I saw. So a lot of my research I did on YouTube. Um, this couple, Evan and Caitlin, had a couple YouTube videos about using resin, and they kind of went over a lot of tips and tricks, which helped me a lot when I first started out. They talked about mixture times, making sure that you stir the mixture long enough to make sure that that chemical reaction happens. Because if you don't, then your resin has problems hardening. um, they also gave some ideas of products to add as far as like colors go, and like adding little beads and stuff like that. um, they also talked about hardening times, and you know, once that chemical reaction starts, you have a limited amount of time to work until it is completed and is fully hardened, and you can't alter the resin anymore. So if you're putting things in it, or you're pouring it with other, like mixing different colors, you kind of have to be aware of how long it's going to take for that chemical reaction to finish. um, so you don't run out of time to create the art that you're trying to create. um Also, they talked about using a blowtorch for air bubbles on the top of the exposed resin. um Air bubbles happen a lot with resin. It's kind of one of the biggest like challenges with it, is making sure to avoid those, and I'll talk more about that later. They also talked about using shinier silicone molds if you want a shinier finish from your resin. I also learned a lot from this account, Anne Marie Ritterhoff. She kind of does things more old school and makes her own molds. And she had a lot of good tips about like layering colors and where to put additives like beads and stuff like that, and good ways to pour and how to manipulate the resin once it is poured to give different textures and effects within the resin. So she had a lot of great tips, more creativity wise, and like manipulating the resin wise is less, I don't know what I'm trying to say, never mind. So for my inspiration, I mostly looked on Instagram. There's so many accounts that are dedicated to resin. This is just some of the main ones that I got stuff from, but a lot of it was just videos of either people pouring their resin or demolding their resin. These accounts kind of gave me some good ideas of places I could order molds and what kind of molds were available, and also just ideas on things I might want to add, things I might want to try and mimic as far as like textures and colors go, things I can experiment with adding in there, you know, all kinds of ideas. So that was kind of where I got a lot of my inspiration, and I just saved pictures from accounts and, you know, kind of watched what they did and tried to mimic that within my own art. So the biggest things I learned with my research were the proportions matter, making sure that you have the correct ratio of liquid resin to hardener, and just being aware that it varies. So to check on whatever kind of resin you use to make sure that you have that ratio correct. The other thing I learned was that air bubbles are very easily created. Like I said, they're one of the biggest challenges with working with resin, and different ways on how to avoid them from happening. And then also being aware of time, making sure you spend enough time mixing your resin, and then also being aware of hardening times and working within that. I had two different types of resin I worked with, and the first one that I worked with was a quick hardening one, so it would harden in like an hour, um, rather than the second one I used, which would harden over, it would take like 2 to 3 days. So I'll kind of go over my first attempts. Excuse me, let me drink some water. Okay, so the first time I did this, I did use like rubber molds, but they were for like baking, so I don't think that they were like the best thing to use. The succulent one was okay, and I've still like used that towards the end, but I did have problems with I think because it was a quick, these were all done with the quick hardening resin. It got, when that reaction happens, it heats up, and I think when that happened, it kind of melted to the molds, because like you can kind of see it in some of those little succulents. Once they're pulled out, there's like little pieces of green stuff stuck to them, and that's ripped from that mold. And then you can kind of see in the top left photo, I kind of over poured, and then also when I was trying to blow out air bubbles, again, it was really hot already, and I had flakes of glitter in there, and then I hit it with a blowtorch, and it kind of burned it. So that was one thing that I kind of struggled with and learned a lesson on. It gets really hot when it's a fast reaction. And then you can kind of see, and I tried to use beads and I didn't really get the desired effect. And then I had a lot of problems with air bubbles. And that also came from me not stirring my mixture slowly. So that was another thing that I learned as I went, was that you have to mix the mixture slowly but for long enough to avoid air bubbles. So that was my first go around. I just used like liquid inks to dye it and just mixed it up into little cups. I also didn't really have a plan going in, and I didn't work fast enough because this is my first time using it, and I didn't know how quick the quick hardening was. So that was something else that I kind of took away from that first experience. So the second time I did this was that bottom row, and you can see like there's tons of air bubbles still. It's still burnt on that bottom right one. I planned a little bit more, and I got some different like textures that were better, but you know, I still had a lot of problems going on. But after that, I kind of like got the hang of it. I made sure I set a timer for how long that I stirred the mixture for, and then I stirred it slowly. And then I also poured more slowly, and I planned everything out ahead of time, which is how I got these two little blue boxes, which I think turned out really nice. And these were the first ones that did. And I think also using molds that were intended for resin helped a lot. So those were my first two kind of victories, and I was like, all right, cool, I'm ready to push forward. So like I said, this is what I kind of learned. Resin gets really hot. If it's a fast hardening one, that chemical reaction is happening a lot faster, so it heats up a lot faster, and it gets a lot hotter as it's happening faster. Does that make, you know what I mean? I don't know science. But yeah, so being aware of that, again, stirring the mixture slowly on to prevent air bubbles, and giving it enough time and all that, being patient, planning ahead, especially with the quick hardening one. And also it just helps because resin's also sticky, so you can't really like, it's hard to like open a package of glitter if you have like gloves on that are covered in sticky resin. And it's just a messy-ish material. So it's good to plan ahead so everything's ready to go, so you don't have to touch as much stuff. And then also, like I said, using different molds. So this was kind of my second attempts. So like I said about resin getting hot, it also can melt stuff. If you look at that purple box, there's like little black, little pokey things coming out. I tried to put a cute little spider in there, and he melted. And those are his legs left. So yeah, I had to be careful with the quick hardening resin. Luckily though, as you can see with a little cockroach coaster, which is one of my favorite things I've ever made, with the resin I started using that took a day or two to harden, that wasn't as much of a concern. It doesn't get as hot at all, since that process is happening over several days rather than minutes. And you can also see in the lid of that purple one, those air bubbles starting to form. The places I had the most problems with air bubbles were in the lids. I think having those little areas to kind of hide in made it a huge issue. So that was something I tried to kind of battle just by taking a toothpick and trying to kind of pop all the air bubbles in there. So that was something I tried. And then also pouring differently and starting on the outside rim and then pouring in the middle. And then the other place I saw a lot of problems with air bubbles was if I put additives in that bottom right box with the gold and rose petals. You can kind of see there's a little bit of, there's air bubbles kind of where that rose is right underneath my finger. And that's just from like not pouring around there, and not also like kind of submerging that rose into the mold, and making sure that the resin surrounded it. It's kind of hard to explain, but hopefully that makes sense. And then another problem I had was I put like these rosebuds on the bottom of this little cup thing down here. And that was the first time that I had like resin and stuff that was exposed. Like that bottom isn't flat, and so I had to figure out how to deal with sanding that down so it would sit flat. And then so this is kind of, there's no particular timeline for all this stuff. It all kind of happened within the same couple months. And I kind of had the same issues with everything. So like I said, you can see in that bottom middle picture, that lid, there's in that top right corner, there's an air bubble, but for the most part, I was starting to get better about trying to poke them out of there, but sometimes they happen. I started using that little succulent mold to add little toppers for the lids, which I think was really cute and a fun idea. I started using, I started using them in this one too, but I ordered dried flowers to add in there. And then one of the things I noticed, especially with the top right photo, those flowers were thicker than the space they had to be in the mold. So when I put them in there, it kind of stretched it because they're rubber, you can stretch them, and then poured the resin around them. And when I did that and it hardened, it changed the shape of the mold. And that kind of was a problem with quite a few of the flowers. Like in that purple one, those flowers were bigger than the mold, so it stretched it out a little bit. Same with the one in the bottom left corner. Molds, they're good because you can stretch them and manipulate them to a certain extent, but doing that does make them kind of lose their true shape, which causes problems later on, which I will show you. And then you can see the air bubble in the top middle one. So in this bottom left corner, this was a mold that had ripped, and I was trying to use tape to seal it up. The tape I used did not work, but usually you can sometimes use certain types of tape to fix molds if they have a rip, or to make your own molds. You can use like non-stick paper and certain kinds of tape and make a really big like trays or whatever. You can make whatever molds you want. In that top right photo, the silver and pink, that was when I first started noticing that different like glitters and different different glitters would hold different weight, and so they would sit differently and kind of fall to the bottom or float to the top of the resin. Because when I first poured that little coaster catch-all tray thing, those two were combined. Like I had poured them together and they separated in there, the pink and the silver. They were two, well, okay, they were two separate ones, but I poured like one on one side and then one on the other, and then they all floated. It was weird. So that was something else that I noticed and learned and wanted to pay attention to going forward. And then in that bottom middle box, you can kind of see the edge of the bottom of the box is kind of rounded, and that again is from the mold getting stretched out and kind of just getting deformed as I used it. So some of the biggest takeaways from like the majority of my pours was to pour slowly, slow and steady, and have a little bit of like, again, a plan of how you want to pour things, but also being aware of making sure that you coat things that are submerged within the resin. Also having patience. There was a couple of pieces that I just got anxious to see, and so I pulled them out of their molds too quickly, and they ended up getting a little deformed. So having patience to just let them sit, and then also having patience to slowly stir to avoid the air bubbles. I think that was my biggest thing, is because usually when I stir things, I'm stirring like a maniac because I want to get it done because I hate stirring stuff. But I had to slowly stir. So being careful of the corners and edges where air bubbles like to form little pockets. And then additive placement, kind of planning ahead of what it's going to look like once it's pulled. And also, again, making sure that it's completely coated by the resin once it's in the mold. So these were some of my last ones, or the ones that I did more recently. And I really like how they turned out. The spider thing on the right, that was what the spider looked like from the purple box before he melted. And then you can kind of see in that heart box with the glitter on the bottom, again, how that glitter was mixed up in that mixture, and it all settled at the, well, it's set, so the mold is upside down when it's sitting there, so the glitter settled to the bottom, which ended up being the top. That makes sense. And you can kind of see it too in the one above. That black glitter was mixed into the whole thing, and then it settled all on the bottom. Yeah, so these are kind of my final products. The one on the left has a lot of flowers in it, and it was difficult to make because that mold had been used a lot. So, and then I also ordered actual keychain rings for my keychain mold. I am waiting to get a bookmark mold, a light switch cover, which will be really fun. And then I ordered new boxes. All my molds are a little bit stretched out at this point. So I ordered all kinds of new ones. So for my latest attempts, the ratio mixture matters. I know I learned that a long ago, but I actually kind of saw what happens if you don't have the ratio, because I ran out of hardener before my resin, so it was a little bit sticky texture on the bottom of it. Some of them, my molds don't last. Like I said, some of them are really stretched out, some of them have ripped, so I'm waiting for new ones to come. And then sanding, using that to kind of polish off everything and get rid of anything that's kind of sticking out. Make sure the edges are clean. Yeah, just making sure that it has a clean finish. And then again, the weight of the additives and kind of where they might settle in your mixture, and making sure that you're aware of that, and making sure that you're still getting your desired result, even if it floats somewhere. Sorry, got off on a lost my train of thought. So my final thoughts about using resin is that it is a great resource, and it's great to know how to use because you can use it for a lot of stuff. Especially being artists, it's a great thing to know how to use. It does get kind of expensive between the molds and the resin itself, and buying inks and additives and stuff like that. But on the other hand, it is a sellable thing. You can I've sold a bunch of my finished products, which was awesome. And I had some people request stuff to be made, which was cool. So it is kind of expensive, but it's not like you can't kind of make back some of the money you put into it. And because it's expensive, and especially right now, it's kind of impossible to get. I didn't get to do my final big thing that I wanted to do, which was I wanted to make a tray with fairy lights around the outside of it. And I wanted to kind of make the mold myself and have it be pretty big. But unfortunately, I ran out of resin before I could, and it was like $300 to get more of the kind that I had been using. I don't have $300, so I'm hoping that later on I will be able to order more resin and do that. Yeah, I saw an Instagram video of it, and it was really cool. It's just so you take the little battery powered LED lights and you put them in the resin, and it looks so cool. But yeah, hopefully one day I'll be able to do it. So yeah, my future plans with working with resin, I want to attempt to do some larger pieces, like I said, and then also experiment with not having a mold, and just kind of like play with it as its own thing on no stick paper and like with tape, and kind of make my own molds, and then experiment with new additives. Like I said, I want to play with fairy lights and some dried butterflies, and I also want to play with some alcohol inks because they have a really cool reaction within the resin. And then I also want to try and use it as a finish on some paintings and see how that rolls. Oh, I think that's it. So yeah, that's basically my experience with resin. I really liked using it. I learned a lot about it as a material, and I still enjoy using it. Like I said, it's really expensive, but I hope I'm able to get more because I want to keep making stuff and keep experimenting with it. There's so much you can do with it, and I've just like barely scratched the surface with just doing stuff with mold. So I'm looking forward to keep playing with it and learn more about it. That is all. Thank you.